Right. Hello, everyone. Glad to have you join us. I know we've got some people joining, so I may just wait a few more seconds and let people in. Hope you all are having a good afternoon. All right, looks like the number has stopped. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today I am here to talk about imposter syndrome. I'm going to start by talking about some definitions related to imposter syndrome, some things that you might think of in terms of symptoms or experiences that might relate to imposter syndrome. And then toward the end, we'll talk about what you might do in terms of navigating or coping with imposter syndrome. Feel free to let me know as we go along. If you have any questions, you can drop questions in the chat. Or if there are specific experiences that you want to share, I'll have some questions as we go along that you're welcome to. If you relate to the questions or the prompts, feel free to drop in the chat kind of what your own experience of imposter syndrome has been. But to get us started here, I've got this comic, and it says, all these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. But the thing is, you'll notice everybody in the comic is thinking the same thing. And so even though imposter syndrome is maybe a term that has become more common, that we might talk about a bit more than we used to, it's still something that a lot of people experience and don't talk about. And so as we go along, this is also kind of an idea and an opportunity maybe to find new ways to navigate imposter syndrome, is also to talk to other people about their experiences, because you may find out that you're not alone in that experience as well. So in terms of imposter syndrome and talking a bit more about specifically what we mean, I've got a list of questions here. And so I want you to think about whether or not you might relate to each of these prompts. Do you secretly worry that others will find out that you're not as bright and capable as they think you are? Do you sometimes shy away from challenges because of nagging self-doubt? Do you tend to chalk your accomplishments up to being a fluke, no big deal, or the fact that people just like you? Do you hate making a mistake, being less than fully prepared, or not doing things perfectly? Do you tend to feel crushed by even constructive criticism, seeing it as evidence of your ineptness? When you do succeed, do you think, whew, I fooled him this time, but I may not be so lucky next time? Do you believe that other people, including students, colleagues, even competitors, are smarter and more capable than you are? Do you live in fear of being found out, discovered, unmasked? And so if you related to many of these or really any of these, then you might be experiencing some symptoms of imposter syndrome. So before we talk about kind of how to cope with these, we're going to talk a little bit more about some definitions and some of the ways that this experience can create challenges. So in terms of definitions, so imposter syndrome is the questioning of one's intellectual ability, attributing success to external factors, fear of exposure that intellectual ability and accomplishments will be exposed as false or fraudulent. So this kind of fear that you're a fraud and other people are going to find out. And so there's this like fear of exposure, and also this self-doubt of your own abilities, of a sense of belongingness in a particular place, or feeling worthy. And there may be pieces that you think of that could be in addition to this as well. And another thing to bring up is that this affects different people in different ways. And so research does indicate that feelings of imposter syndrome may occur at higher rates for women and people of underrepresented racial, ethnic, and religious minority groups. And this can be about both social and systemic factors for when spaces are opened up to new people, and whether or not there is room for people to join as well. Early imposter syndrome doesn't really take into account the impact of individual identities. And so that's something to keep in mind as well when you look at research related to imposter syndrome specifically. So when we think about imposter syndrome, there's often a cycle of reactions and behavior that shows up. And so it starts at the top of the wheel. So you might get a new task or a project. And then the reaction that you have to that could potentially go one or two ways, both of which probably include anxiety, but there might be some procrastination or some avoidance of the task, or in the opposite direction, some over preparation for the task. The next thing that might happen is that then the project is eventually going to get completed, and there will be a brief sense of relief and accomplishment at having completed the project. But pretty quickly after this, there can be some rationalization that happens. So I was lucky, somebody else would have done a better job. There's this kind of downplaying if it goes well. There may also be some downplaying if it doesn't go well, with procrastination, it can often be, well, I didn't have enough time. And so there, even if there's this sense of relief or the thing goes really well, there might be a way that we tell ourselves that it wasn't actually because we did something good or because we're skilled. Pretty quick to dismiss that. And then the next phase is increased self-doubt, anxiety, feeling like a fraud. So even if something turns out well, you have a good outcome, the way that you talk to yourself about how that happened can really impact how you see yourself. And that can just kind of perpetuate the system of feeling like an imposter, feeling like a fraud, feeling like a failure as well. And there can be a range of different ways that this shows up for people. So there's a number of different, types of imposter syndrome that are displayed here. And these aren't, concrete. There can be overlap between a lot of these, and people may experience more than one of these as well. But just to go through them. So the first one is the perfectionist. So perfectionists set unrealistically high goals and are never satisfied with their achievements. And this might relate to one of the prompts that was about being upset if you don't perform perfectly or setting really high goals for yourself. And there's the superhero. So these people feel they must excel in all different roles they play in their life. So being able to do a little bit of everything and doing really well in all of those things that you're trying to do. The next one is the expert. So experts are always hungry to learn more about their field of expertise in order to maintain their position as experts. So this one is more kind of focused on the field and the sense of expertise, as opposed to the superhero, which is trying to be really good at everything. Then there's the natural genius. So people who tend to think that intelligence must be inherent, which might mean, well, I'm just not smart enough. Everybody else got something in their genes or something like that that I didn't get. And the last one is the soloist. So they love to work alone, and their self-worth is tied to their own ability and productivity. So you have to work on your own in order to be able to judge kind of that the outcome is related to your work as well. And I mentioned that these aren't like kind of in distinct boxes. People may experience different pieces of each of these, but there may be one that you relate to more than others. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. So I mentioned a lot of things related to imposter syndrome, different experiences that people might have. And so this can also be a moment for you to reflect on what your experience of this is. It may depend on your role. There may be different times where this has shown up for you, and times where it hasn't, depending on, coming to college, what that might feel like, thinking about maybe going to graduate or professional school. Each of those brings about a different, maybe sense of self-doubt or worry. And so there might be certain areas of your life where this comes up more than others. Often we're talking about this in academic terms, but I would imagine that it could come up in other roles in your life. So going back to that initial slide with the comic on it, where a whole bunch of people were thinking that they were a failure, that they felt like a fraud. This isn't something that we talk about much. In fact, people often don't share what they might think of as their failures, or their mistakes, their missteps. Instead, we often talk about our successes, and there's lots of ways that social media exacerbates this as well. If we think about like what we get to see in people's lives, what people are posting about on social media, it's usually the things that are going really well. which might mean that we tend to think that things are going really well for people because that's all we're seeing. And in fact, may not be going really well. There may be some mistakes or things that are going on behind the scenes that we just don't have access to. And so I think that can give us this sense that if I'm feeling like a fraud and nobody else is telling me that they feel like a fraud, then I must be a fraud. That there must be something uniquely wrong with me that is leading me to feel this way. And what we actually know from the research is that about 70% of people will experience at least one episode of imposter syndrome at some point in their life. And this can kind of lead also to recognizing that one of the tips that I'm going to have for you in terms of how to cope with imposter syndrome is to talk to other people about what their experiences might be. Because I think knowing that you're not alone in this, recognizing that maybe other people are struggling, maybe people who you thought weren't struggling, people who you thought just kind of naturally were able to handle it all, that they have these feelings too. I think that can help us shift how we think about this. And maybe it isn't something that is inherently wrong with us, but something that a lot of people in this kind of situation experience. So something to think about. So when it comes to like, how do we cope with imposter syndrome? I'm going to talk about 4 steps. You'll notice that this spells out ABC. So the first step is going to be acknowledging your thought patterns. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a bit more detail. But acknowledge your thought patterns, balance your perspective, celebrate your successes, and do an experiment. So when it comes specifically to thought patterns, it's important for us to pay attention to the ways that our brains work, and how this can, while it might be like efficient, because that's what our brain is trying to do, is trying to be efficient, it can have negative consequences. And there are some like unhelpful ways of thinking that it's important for us to pay attention to, because if we pay attention to them and become more aware of them, then we can be in a better position to challenge them, or to create some distance from the thoughts, or to do something about them. So I'm just going to talk through some of these examples that are here. These aren't all of what we might think of as the common thought patterns, but these are the ones that specifically relate to imposter syndrome. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is this mental filter. So the mental filter occurs when somebody only pays attention to one type of evidence. And usually what we know is that that evidence is often upsetting or negative, and then we ignore any evidence that's counter. So in psychology, we have this phrase that people would rather be right than happy. And what that means is that, for example, if we have a lot of criticisms of ourselves, or we think that we're maybe not smart enough or not good enough or something, we're constantly going to be looking for evidence that that is true, rather than being able to take in all of the evidence that may exist. So for example, you could think that you're actually a failure, think that you're not very smart, but then when you get an A on an exam, right? So that's some evidence that maybe that's not true. You're going to tell yourself, oh, that was just a fluke, or everybody must have done well because I can't be the only person, or I can't have done better than anybody else. And there are ways that we rationalize this to dismiss evidence that doesn't fit the narrative that we have for ourselves. And so what that can also lead to is us really focusing on the negative at all times, which might be like, if we're thinking about that one test, we might be more likely to focus on questions that we missed, rather than all of the questions that we got right. And so honing in on specific kinds of evidence can have those kinds of negative consequences, where we miss out on seeing evidence that might convince us otherwise. Another type of thought pattern could be disqualifying the positive. These kind of relate to one another. So discounting good things that have happened to you or that you have done for some reason or another. So again, you know, when you get that A on the exam, telling yourself that doesn't count. Coming up with reasons that good outcomes we can't actually attribute to ourselves. They have to be about some external reason that has nothing to do with us. Because that allows us to maintain that kind of negative self-talk or self-doubt. Another example would be overgeneralization, or overgeneralizing. And that's where we see a pattern based upon one single data point, or we're overly broad in the conclusions that we draw about something. And so the examples that are of up here on the slide, or everything is always rubbish, or nothing good ever happens. And so that might be, for example, if you apply for a job and you don't get hired, you could have the thought, well, I didn't get that job, so no one wants to hire me. Where actually, it's just one person or one company that didn't hire you. And a good way to think about this is if you're using like always, never, everything, nothing, that might be a good signal to you that you're using overgeneralization as a thought pattern. Another example down here in this bottom left corner is emotional reasoning. And so that's where we assume that because we feel a certain way, what we think must be true. So for example, I feel embarrassed, so I must be an idiot. And emotions are really important. And so we don't want to discount our emotions. They can provide us with useful information. But that doesn't always mean that they're 100% accurate to a situation, or that the way that we're connecting things is necessarily true. So feeling embarrassed doesn't necessarily mean that you're an idiot. Feeling like a fraud doesn't necessarily mean that you are a fraud and that it has to be true. And so it can be important for us to kind of dig down into those a little bit. Maybe create some distance from that immediate emotional reaction so we can look at whether or not the conclusion that we're going to draw from that is true. The last one that I'm going to talk about is jumping to conclusions. We might also think about this as mind reading. So there's two types of jumping to conclusions. There's mind reading, so imagining we know what others are thinking, and there's fortune telling, where we predict the future. And an example of this might be if you're responding to a question in class, you might imagine that others or the professor are thinking negative things about you. So you may say to yourself, they probably think my answer was stupid, or they don't think that I should be in this class, or they wish that I hadn't spoken up. And those are all things that like you don't actually have access to, because you don't know exactly what those people were thinking. And it might like kind of connect with other things where you're thinking negative things, and so you're going to assume that other people are thinking those same things about you, which we don't necessarily know are true. And in fact, the opposite may be true. We just don't have access to that information. And so again, these aren't all of the negative thought patterns, but they are ones that might specifically relate to imposter syndrome. There are some of these that you might notice that you do yourself. And it's really in trying to identify these. And as we identify them and become more aware of the ways that they show up in our life, that's when we can do something about them, which is the next step, which is balance. So if you notice yourself having one of these thoughts, one thing that you can do is maybe take a pause and be like, okay, I'm doing that thing that seems to be happening. And depending on what the thought pattern is, you might ask yourself some questions. So if you think that the thought pattern, for example, is discounting the positive, or is the mental filtering, you might say, well, what is the evidence that I have that this isn't true? Are there pieces that I'm missing here? How likely is it that this is true? Or like, what are the odds that that's actually going to happen? Um, and so there's different kinds of ways that we can challenge the thoughts that we're having, take a pause, maybe what is an alternative thought that I could be having that might be more accurate, that might include more information than that immediate response that I have. And this can be helpful for people to do on their own. Sometimes it's more helpful to be able to talk that out with other people. And so, you might say to a friend, like, oh my gosh, I just had this thought that, whatever it might be, like, do you think that's true? Or did you have the same reaction? And so talking to other people can also give us some perspective in ways that sometimes it's hard for us to do for ourselves. And getting that other perspective, like another person might be able to highlight evidence that we are ignoring, which can be really helpful, and then can maybe be something to remind yourself of. And so all of these pieces are going to help you to reframe your thinking, to pay more attention to those patterns, and maybe challenge them when they're getting in your way. So that was A and B. So acknowledging your thought patterns, balancing your perspective. The C is celebrating your successes. So some things for you all to think about. Maybe this is a moment to sit and really think about some of these questions. What have been some of your recent successes? And then how have you celebrated yourself in those moments? This goes back to that idea that we're pretty quick to discount positive things. And so really being able to acknowledge when something positive does happen and take the time to celebrate that can challenge that pattern for ourselves. It makes us more aware so that we can have a more balanced perspective. And this doesn't necessarily have to be celebrating everything. You know, maybe there are some successes that feel more meaningful to you than others. But it can be celebrating the small things too. And that's okay. And then the last one here is what gets in the way of acknowledging what you've done well or when you've done well. And so thinking about what the barriers are for you and how you might challenge some of those barriers to create space for yourself. Um, and this doesn't have to be, you know, spending a lot of money or taking a lot of time. It could just be a moment that you do something that you enjoy, that you share a success with somebody else who's important to you and who supports you. And so remembering that celebration is important for us as well. Okay, so it's celebrating our successes. The last strategy is to do an experiment. And so this can look a couple of different ways. When we talked about that pattern, that cycle of imposter syndrome, one of the things that we talked about was procrastination or avoidance. And so something that you might try is really challenging those avoidance behaviors. If you notice yourself avoiding a task, maybe just trying to get started. Tell yourself, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to open the document. And that's going to be my first step. And then we'll see what happens from there. Because I think for a lot of people, what they notice is that getting started is maybe the hardest part, or that the task is, we anticipate that it's going to be harder, that we're going to dread it more. We're going to be really uncomfortable than we actually do when we sit down to do a task. And so sometimes this can just be about taking that first step to break that avoidance pattern. Another kind of experiment, so that's like a behavioral experiment. You're doing something different, trying something new. Another kind of experiment might be getting feedback from others. So, you know, if you're worried that you're not doing well or that you're not smart enough, could be checking in with friends, checking in with peers. Maybe you find out that like a lot of people are really struggling in that class and it's not just you. And so that could be helpful because we're pretty good at being really critical of ourselves. And so this is just an opportunity to really check out some of the negative thoughts that you might be telling yourself, both to see if other people feel that way and also to see how other people perceive you, because other people are actually thinking more positive things about you than you're thinking about yourself. And so it can be helpful for us to get that feedback and support as well. Another kind of experiment might be practicing self-compassion. So noticing when you're being really critical of yourself and taking a moment to be kinder to yourself. So self-compassion is a specific term in psychology, and there's a website that's about self-compassion and contains a range of self-compassion exercises related to mindfulness and meditation, but also just like really working on being kinder to yourself. And so part of what this means is recognizing that we're all works in progress, and that self-doubt is something that most humans experience and is more proof of your humanity than your inadequacy. And so really trying to be kind to yourself, maybe recognizing that you're doing the best that you can, and that you are where you are for a reason as well. And so those are a range of kinds of experiments that you might try that relate to behavior, interacting with other people, and also being kinder to yourself, thinking about how you talk about yourself. This slide just kind of gives, you know, some other smaller ways that you might think about managing imposter syndrome. Some of these I've already talked about, and some are a little bit different. So the tips that are on here are keep a journal, set some goals, might say set some realistic goals, build a professional support network, get 360 feedback, so get feedback from a range of people. Update your CV. You might think about this as a way to acknowledge the things that you have accomplished, and to make sure that you really pay attention to and celebrate those. Get a coach. That could be a specific coach related to certain kinds of behaviors. You could also think about that in terms of like counseling or therapy. Recognize learning and failure are okay, and that it's all part of the process. Keep a positive feedback file. So I've certainly known students who, when they get some kind of positive feedback or they do really well on an exam or something, they kind of file that away in a folder. And then in a moment where they're maybe feeling more critical of themselves or really struggling on a particular day, you can pull out that folder, and look at it, and it's there to remind you of all of the things that have gone well. Do things outside of work that make you feel good. So knowing that work doesn't have to be the only thing that gives you a sense of self-worth or a sense of value, and that it can be helpful to have a range of things outside of that. And then say it out loud to someone you trust. I feel like a fraud, and see kind of what their response might be. It might be that they give you some positive feedback. It might also be that they tell you that they feel that way too sometimes. And either way, that could be really helpful. And then my last slide here just has some information on the Counseling Center, and how to get in contact with us or with TRACS. TRACS is the kind of the mental health hub here on campus. And then if you are an online student, you do also have access to other online mental health resources at UK. And so you might look at the UK Wellbeing website as well to get some more information on that. Happy to answer any additional questions that you all might have, but that is the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, but I'll hang out here, and happy to answer any questions that you have specifically, or about imposter syndrome or the counseling center. But thank you all for your attendance. I hope this was helpful.